Hello, folks. It's nice to see you. My name is Dustin Cormier. You can find me on Howtorockastrology, my YouTube channel. I'm very excited today to be talking about a presentation that I've been concocting. I've done this with a few astrologers, and today I've invited my dear friend Michael Moon from the Temple of Sound to join me to talk about these Neptune and Pluto cycles, as well as the Pluto and Capricorn eclipses, as well as Pluto and Aquarius eclipses. You can find Michael on his own website, templeofsound.com, or is it the Temple of Sound? I should check
The
that.
Temple of Sound.
Thank you, Michael. It's thetempleofsound.com. And thanks so much for hanging out with me, mate.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Michael is a fellow astrologer in my scene. We've hung out, we're both musicians. We've hung out together, and we found that we really get a good back and forth when it comes to talking astrology. So I was happy to have you here to talk about some of these significant planetary forecasts that I see coming in the end of this decade and even pouring into the next coming years after.
Great. Astro Jam.
Astro Jam, gotta love it. So thanks everybody for hanging out with us here. Now, I've got a little bit of a presentation that I thought that I would sort of spin up. Me and Michael are going to chat a little bit about a few key themes that we're going to see happening in the presentation. And then I'm just going to get into it. And then closer to the end, me and Michael are going to have a little bit of an organic conversation about the transits that we see happening sometime in the year 2027 and 2028. In particular, again, it's when Pluto is in the sign of Aquarius, and the North Node is going to be in Aquarius with Pluto. There's going to be an eclipse that happens there. And there are significations that are important there. My presentation is going to lead us up to some long-standing trends that are all converging at that same time. Now, just for a little bit of understanding for folks here, I like to say we're not trying to be Nostradamus here. What we're trying to do is speak to long-standing converging trends that do happen. I said this on a few videos that I've been doing this presentation on. There's an old story that comes from Vasishta's Yoga, and it's about an apprentice and a master sage are sitting together. And they look up and they see on a coconut tree, there's a crow, and the crow caws. And as soon as the crow caws, a coconut falls. And the student notices that they happen at the same time. The next 2 minutes, the crow caws and another coconut falls. And the student looks at the master and says, "Master, it seems to me that every time the crow caws, a coconut falls." And the master says, "Not necessarily." The master is wise and doesn't always correlate things that happen in synchronicity. But this is, and I've been saying this, it's important as mystical people in the world of astrology to be skeptical about these patterns. But that doesn't mean that we can't blind ourselves completely to synchronistic data when it happens. This is the caveat that I wanted to give. I'm this type of thinker, just because there are synchronicities, we don't have to take it all wholesale, but we don't have to throw it away wholesale. Does that make sense, Michael, the way I'm kind of spilling that out?
It does. I would say synchronicity is very important, but it doesn't mean it's synchronous. It's not like a very specific meaning. There's a felt meaning to it as well. One thing I would say is to impart as we go through these transits and we see the cycles of history, it's very important to know history, even outside of astrology, to see the cycles of our human existence and how these cycles repeat and change and evolve, to understand where we are and where we can go
and where we've been.
And these synchronicities, these cycles do have, in my understanding, a very strong correlation and synchronistic energetic flow, but you can't correlate exact. Meaning, just because this transit happened in the 1400s, and it's happening again now, that we're going to have the exact same stuff that happened in the 1400s,
Right.
because we have that transit plus all the others that are different. Now, what we're going to be getting into here is that there's going to be layers. And when you have more and more correlations, you get more and more close to themes. But these are themes. They're also themes that happen at a different time, a different cycle in the spiral towards our evolution. So they're going to happen in different ways. And they're going to happen in ways that are relate to our consciousness. And just like if I have two people born the same week, they're going to have completely different charts, even though there's
There will be
similarities.
similarities, right?
And they will have, and even if you have two people born the same day, they'll have very similar kind of timing of life events and past, but their consciousness that they bring to that on a level of what they've brought here is unique. And
perfect
also
example.
where what they're gonna do with that.
Perfect example,
So
Michael.
the freedom fate thing, like we have the freedom to make the best of these transits, and we have the potential to just let them take us over. That in between is where we're playing
where we're
with. The more
standing,
conscious we are, the more we can use them consciously versus just being swept up in that sort of tide.
For sure. And as astrologers, everybody that is going to be seeing this video is going to be in tune with this. It's just good. It's always good to give a caveat of the kind of consciousness that we're moving forward with, especially in the world of predictive patterns, you know?
And the idea that as soon as you put fear and prediction and like, oh, this happened, and then is that going to mean it's going to be this, and then being all afraid of it, and then putting that out and then sharing that with everybody, and you just increase that energy, right? Increase the probability.
Right. And I think it's fair to say that me and Michael are both optimistic minded. Really, I would consider myself a hippie, and I think you're kind of in that same sphere too. We're here sharing in the ideas of when we think the paint is wet, we can all paint a good picture together in an optimistic way. And it's
always wet.
Yeah, bingo. Yeah, and the picture can always be created how we want it to. Now, in terms of what we're going to be expecting in today's lecture, in today's discussion, I should say, I have one key picture that's going to give us the guts of what to expect. This is just sort of an overarching theme that I see coming through this presentation. It's the dissemination of systemic sovereignty and power. We're going to mention how in the pre-1400s, God in the church, this kind of dark ages consciousness, where there was considered to be an autocratic rule by God, and the church acted as the arbiter of power at this time. Now, around the 1500s, some things started to happen. We're going to talk about Martin Luther and how he sort of questioned the authority of the Catholic Church, which is a very big rebellious thing at that time. As well, the character of Henry VIII also instituted his divine right of kings, where now the king was considered to be the arbiter of power for God, for the church. Around the 1700s, we have the Great American Revolution. And this is when democracy, bureaucracy, plutocracy, the modern forms of government started to take form. And all of these are relating to Pluto cycles, mind you. This was before the Enlightenment era Pluto cycle. In the 1500s, Pluto came again into Capricorn and Aquarius. In the mid 1700s, we know that Pluto came into Capricorn and Aquarius. This is America's birth chart is said to have Pluto in Capricorn. And in today's coming times, we see Pluto has been in Capricorn in the last, I believe, about 20-ish years. And it's been around now that Pluto is coming into Aquarius, as we're going to see. And it's at this time that another wave of important things are happening. And I think that it might be leaning towards what I call individual sovereignty. The power of dissemination of power has been coming from this vague God to monarchy, to democracy. And now in today's times where everybody, power it comes by an Aquarian sense of what everyone think is cool through our phones and through the media. Whatever is the hot, trendy thought seems to be the king of today's time. And this is what I mean by individual sovereignty in a way. Now, it's a funny thing to think about, but it's leading towards the power being in the individual. And we're going to talk about this a little bit as we go along. Now, what do you say I start getting into my presentation here, Michael?
You go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're discussing some important transits that have been occurring over centuries of time. We'll be specifically speaking to the 3 outer planets, and we're going to talk about them in the short term of today's time, but we're going to observe how long-term trends are converging in the coming era of about 2025 to 2028. At the end of the video, we're going to talk about the 3 outer planets and the basis of a kite. Pluto in Aquarius, it's Neptune in Aries, and Uranus in Gemini. They're all going to come into masculine signs at the same time in tight angles starting around 2025, 2026. Now, another huge theme that is going to be occurring is considering that the eclipses of the north and south nodes to the planet Pluto are going to occur in the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. And I'm going to mention how important Capricorn and Aquarius are. Just as a quick little aside here, Capricorn and Aquarius are considered to be the material gates. And it's particularly because anciently Saturn ruled Aquarius and Saturn ruled Capricorn, and Saturn also ruled Aquarius anciently. Modern astrologers, we in the Western tradition, we kind of say that Pluto, I actually mean like Uranus. Uranus is considered to be a sub-ruler of Aquarius. So since Aquarius has Uranus for a sub-ruler, Saturn is still considered to be the primary arbiter of all things Aquarius. And this is why when Pluto is in Capricorn and it comes into Aquarius, we see mass transformations of the material world and of government power and policy. The Vedic people, I'm a tropical Vedic astrologer. I blend Western and tropical, Western and Vedic. And how the Vedic people describe the chakras is that it relates to the signs. I've talked with you before, Michael. Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. And then the next chakra is Sagittarius and Pisces, to the Sagittarius being to the left of Capricorn and Pisces being to the right of Aries. And then next we have Scorpio and Aries. Then we have Libra and Taurus at the heart chakra. We have Gemini and Virgo at the throat chakra, speaking, communicating. And then we have Cancer and Leo at the 6th chakra. Cancer and Leo represent the crown chakra. Leo manifests into Capricorn, and then Aquarius manifests into Cancer. So when things are happening with regard to Leo, the spirit is manifesting into material. And then when it comes to the sign of Aquarius, it's a very important time in history because it's one of the times where now we see that what is beginning in the material is being formed for the intentions of spirit. Aquarius leads up to Cancer. And so whenever Pluto is going through Capricorn, we see the end of a certain material-driven cycle. And Pluto in Aquarius represents the sketching out of society, leading towards more spiritually intended purposes. This is liberty of creativity, liberty of the individual. And this is an important thing that I wanted to bring up regarding the meaning of Pluto in Aquarius. And this is why Pluto in Aquarius instigates social changes in the material framework that relates to how people are going to live for the subjective experience of life, not just the hard-driven job and career, but the subjective of what does life mean? What is the meaning of the individual life of every person and every individual?
Could I
Did you
make
have something to share there, Michael?
well,
Please feel
just
free.
a very brief aside where as a, even as a Western astrologer, I, I have found the rulerships most clear using the visible planets, which is what you're talking about.
Right.
That the non-visible planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, that we're going to be talking about, are transpersonal. They only become personal and connected to a visible planet in the personal chart, and they denote the big cycles of time and change in society. And so that's just to sort of give people another window into what you were just talking about.
Certainly.
Each planet rules two signs, a masculine and feminine. So here we have Saturn ruling feminine Capricorn and masculine Aquarius, and etc. all the way up, which you generally just described. This gives a system to really understand. And then Uranus, though it has colors of Aquarius in it, is not equated to it. It's something beyond the personal that we can tap into.
Right. And I agree with that. That's how I generally convey it, is that the first 7 luminaries relates to our actual energy field.
Yeah.
The transpersonal planets relates to spiritual
They're
changes.
bigger energies that are
right.
beyond the personal.
Right. Bingo. And this is a perfect lead in to the next thing that we're going to talk about, Michael. And, I would invite you to be a part of this conversation because the next thing we're going to talk about is the significance of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And you've already given us a really good sort of bite into it. We see in the Vedic tradition, at least Neo-Vedic, we consider Uranus relates to Brahma. And this is sort of a debated thing, but a lot of people consider that Neptune relates to Vishnu and Pluto relates to the destruction of Shiva. Now, how exactly we would correlate these planets, it can be tricky to say, but I think that everybody can agree that Neptune relates to a theme of religious ethics and spirituality, and Pluto relates to government, corporate power, and bureaucracy. And the Neptune and Pluto cycles are going to play a big part of what we're going to describe in this presentation. Essentially, I should say, at this point, that this presentation is looking to entwine these 2 different dimensions. It's the Neptune and Pluto cycles, and then simply Pluto in Capricorn and Aquarius, when having eclipses fall on Pluto in Capricorn and Aquarius. These are descriptions of the power dynamic of spirit and individual liberty of Neptune, as related to the mob rule power of Pluto. And I should say that I've geared this presentation mostly towards Neptune and Pluto cycles. And of course, Uranus is always interweaving because it moves much quicker than those 2 planets. So the playing of Uranus throughout all of this is it's something that I haven't aligned this presentation to because I'm looking at the bigger picture, but Uranus will always play a part.
I'll talk about that at the end because it's pretty important.
Certainly.
And these, whether they align exactly in any specific way, these are big archetypes that are very hard for our human mind to pinpoint to one little thing. So that's part of why they're hard to grasp. That's why they're transpersonal. And so, if you relate exactly to Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, they definitely have this part of this Trinity energy to them, but they're energies that are kind of beyond that. Like you can see in cardinal, fixed, and mutable, the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva energy very strong in astrology. To me, the Uranus, it's like that spark of spirit, the Neptune, the boundaryless openness to dissolving the boundaries, both, all of them really. Saturn as the last visible planet, that the structure, the material world. Then you have the breaking of that structure to open up to the new Uranus, then the true boundarylessness, and then the Pluto core power
Of the
within
soul.
it.
Mm. The
That's the
mystery of
idea.
the universe interacting with the boundarylessness that we experience as humans.
And,
There's still a soul meaning through Pluto.
and as we get to the end and we talk about what's coming, I will talk about the specifics of how those planets are
Perfect.
playing
Wonderful,
out.
Michael. Because that's a perfect way of putting what we're going to do here. At the very end, we're going to describe how it's all converging in today's modern times. So Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto being transpersonal planets, one of my intentions for this presentation was to give people these historical transits so we can kind of see what these planets are actually doing in the chart. I think through a historical presentation that is centuries long, it's almost the only way that we can describe what these outer planets are doing, right?
Exactly.
So that's part of our intention here today. So for the essentially a big theme for this presentation is talking about Neptune and Pluto. We can see the interplay between these archetypes of human collective energy and the dissemination of power and sovereignty that we've talked about here really relates strongly to Neptune and Pluto cycles. And I've mentioned that the gate through which Plutonian transformation occurs in the collective material world infrastructures and framework is through eclipses, south and north node eclipses on Pluto in Capricorn and Aquarius. These eclipses tend to be the trigger points for the trends we see happening. So we see these three main trends occurring in this video. To give it short thrift, because we're going to go through them, trend number one is when Neptune laps Pluto every 500 years. This just happened in 1890. And before that, it happened around 1399, just before the Enlightenment era, just clawing out of the Dark Ages. Neptune happened to lap Pluto around that time. So this is one trend. Trend number two, Michael really gave me the hat tip on what exactly was going on here. And that's part of why I wanted to have you here, Michael, is that trend number two is Pluto comes closer to the sun than Neptune about every 248 years. Of course, we all know that Pluto takes 248 years to go around the zodiac. So that what happens is that in a certain part of Pluto's cycle, Pluto comes closer to the sun. And from our perspective on Earth, it actually seems like Pluto is moving faster than Neptune. Of course, this is an illusion caused by us being on planet Earth. It usually happens particularly, and there are different time lengths here. Michael has noted that really Neptune is in lockstep with Pluto for about 80 to 100 years.
80 years, I'd say.
80 years is how you'd say it. And you have a little diagram that's going to clearly show that as well. Now,
kind of phases in and out. So you're 50 years in total. Like this last one was like 50 years in total and over an 80-year period. The next one will be 80 years more consistent. And that's
Gotcha. Because it has phases. I see what you mean. It's almost like while Pluto, there's a point when Pluto and Neptune are exactly in the same orbit.
And then Pluto actually speeds up and gets faster. So
right.
It oversteps the aspect and then comes back in.
Right.
It is like you can see the whole period where they're in lockstep as like a 100-year period, but when they're in an exact aspect is somewhere in the years we've just talked about.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's right. So we're going to see this occurring, and it really stretches, again, we have different ideas of the exact, with the starting points for this. But what I've given is that when Pluto is about mid Virgo to about late Pluto in Capricorn, that's the 50 years. and those it even spans wider than that, as we've mentioned. So we're
Just,
we're
just to
gonna
give
see this.
people a
Yep.
real sense of the magic or wonder of this and why it's significant. So starting 1950 until 2032, we have this period of 80-ish years. And Pluto and Neptune are in sextile.
Mm-hmm.
But then compare that to as Neptune starts zipping, or it's being pretty consistent, but Pluto starts falling back. And then the period to the next aspect, 30 degrees later, is only 25 years.
Right.
So in 25 years time after this period, you're going to have a square, and another 25 years, you're going to have a trine. So it's
it's
like boom,
going
boom,
much
boom, boom.
faster.
And so to have these this locked in sextile last for so long, which we're coming into the very end of during this period we're talking about, is very key.
Very significant, you know. So what I'm going to do here, Michael, is just so people can get a visual, we're going to talk about trend number 3 as we come along, but it's essentially the south and north node eclipses on Pluto and Capricorn and Aquarius. But since we're talking about this right now, I'd like to take a quick moment and lock it in. This is Pluto's unusual orbit. It's a 3-dimensional phenomenon, which is more so than any other planet. You can see this is the regular ecliptic of all the planets around the sun. And then we see the longer span of the outer planets. Pluto is the one that, you know, how I would describe it. All the other planets have an orbit like this around the sun. Pluto's is like this. It's got a 3-dimensional aspect to it. And this is partly the reason of what's happening here. Essentially, it's
elliptical.
It's elliptical. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you, Michael. So this has its own significance. And a lot of people talk about the rising and falling of Pluto in certain times. Now, what we're really interested in here is Pluto coming closer to the sun than Neptune, because it's so not circular, but more oval.
Elliptical.
So that's what you mean by elliptical. Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Pluto comes closer to the sun than Neptune's orbit. And this is in particular what we're talking about at this time. So let's give everybody a little bit of a visual here. This is this little presentation I've made to kind of show what we're talking about. See, in 1840, Neptune was in the 11th from Pluto. 1870, Neptune was in the 12th. 1882, Neptune was in the same sign within 10 degrees. And then in 1891, Neptune conjuncted Pluto in the sign of Gemini. And this had a lot of, you know, this is trend number 1 as we've discussed it, right? This is Neptune lapping Pluto every 500 years, right? So in 1891, Neptune conjuncted or lapped Pluto. And what happened, you know, we had lots of important world-changing figures that happened here. This includes Hitler and Mao Zedong on the negative side of this. But we also, they were, yes, around this time. Hitler and Mao Zedong both had Neptune conjunct Pluto in Gemini. So did the very important astrologer Dane Rudhyar, as well as Paramahansa Yogananda, and Krishnamacharya, who is the teacher of Patabi Jwas and BKS Iyengar. So lots of important world-changing figures were born around this time. Now, just to give us more of an idea of this sextile, right? In 1915, Neptune was in the second sign from Pluto. And then in 1954, this is around the time that Neptune came to be in this lockstep with Pluto. As we said, it almost looks like Neptune has a retrograde motion compared to Pluto. But we know really what's happening is that Pluto has come closer to the sun than Neptune is. And it's for all of this time. We see in 1954, Pluto's in Leo, Neptune's in Libra. 1958, Pluto's in Virgo and Neptune's in Scorpio. 1972, Pluto's in Libra and Neptune's in Sagittarius. 1985, they go to the next sign. 1999, they go to the next sign. 2012, They're in the next sign. And by this point, Neptune is starting to catch up to its exact sextile of Pluto. Because as we know, right around this time, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, Neptune's sextile from Pluto actually recedes a little bit because Pluto appears to be moving faster. Let's say in 1958, Pluto was about, let's say, 10 degrees of Virgo, and Neptune was about 10 degrees of Scorpio. In 1972, let's say Pluto could have been around 8 degrees of Libra or 10 degrees of Libra. Neptune was falling back from the exact sextile. Neptune could have been around 8 or 6 degrees of Sagittarius. Now I'm just throwing out, you know, the reason I'm saying this is because Neptune appears to be going slower than Pluto, and Pluto appeared to be going faster.
The exact dates, 1950 to 57, they were locked into the sextile. 77 to 86, they were locked in. And coming up 2026 to 2032, the last phase of that.
Right. Now you just sent me a picture that
Neptune.
I might want to show that picture at this point because it was actually a nifty little description.
Do you want me to share it? Is it easier?
I think I have it here, Michael.
Okay.
Thank you, though. I appreciate you.
There we go. Yeah.
But I got the gist of it here. So we see that. Could you explain exactly what we're seeing here?
So that the dark blue line, which is like a zigzag, is at the top of that line. You see where it says 0. That's the exact conjunction. So where it hits that top is where it's exact.
Right.
So it sort of zigzags closer and closer and closer, hits exact, you know, in that period 1950, hits exact in that period 1980-ish, and it hits exact around our time now.
Gotcha. And so this is when Pluto and Neptune do come into their exact sextile.
2030
around 2030 is when they finally, Neptune kind of bursts through the lockstep that it has been in with Pluto.
Yeah.
And so that's what we see here, right? For beforehand, Neptune was moving faster. Then during this period, there was an exact sextile where they're moving forward, but are really locked in with each other. And then it's around 2026, really 2030, when Neptune starts to finally burst through the gate. And I believe what I've got written here is that it's around this period that Neptune is sextile Pluto, as we'll see in our latter part of our discussion.
Exactly.
And then from here, Neptune goes much faster from our perspective. The square to Pluto comes quickly. Pluto is slower is the more proper way to say it. That's correct. Or Pluto is up.
Pluto falls behind.
Yes, that's right. And we're going to see how this affects history, because we can see this has happened in different parts of history. And this is part of what we're expecting to see and through this presentation. And this is trend number 2 that we're talking about. It's Pluto coming closer to the sun than Neptune. Now, it's relevant to note that trend number 2 that we're talking about, this lockstep of Neptune and Pluto, this occurred around the time of the American Great Revolution. But during that time, trend number 1 was not apparent. Trend number 1, if we remember correctly, actually, I probably have it here. Yep. Trend number 1 is Neptune lapping Pluto. Now, in the 1700s, Neptune was actually floating around the 8th or 9th house from Pluto in a balsamic trine, and it wasn't conjunct Pluto. The American Revolution was still significant, and trend number 2 was still occurring. But this shows the importance of the 1500s Renaissance era, because that had both trend number 1 and trend number 2. And I would like to point out that the Renaissance era is a reflection of today's time. And the Renaissance era that we're going to see in the 1300s, the 1400s, and the 1500s, both of these trends were occurring. In the 1300s, Neptune just lapped Pluto, just like it just did for us in late 1800s. And that's the significance of what's going to be coming in this convergence that's happening around 2026, 27, 2028. Now, we should also keep in mind trend number 3, and I'm going to speak to it once we kind of start seeing these coming dates. But for now, we're going to go back in time. We're going to go in our time machine and we're going to visit the late 1300s and into the 1400s when Neptune last conjuncted Pluto. We're going to see the same pattern. 1350, Neptune was in the 11th from Pluto. 1375, Neptune was in the 12th. By 1387, Neptune was within 10 degrees in Taurus. And then 1399, this is just like 1891. Neptune conjuncted Pluto in the sign of Gemini. Now, it's at this point that I want to note the Renaissance era has said to have been started around the 1400 to 1600 AD. It's the Renaissance era that people, this is when alchemists were coming out of the woodwork. Astrology was beginning to become something a little bit more less correlated with witches and more correlated with the nobility of the people in power. There's still a lot of dark medieval times happening around this era, but this is when it started to emerge.
And astronomy started to really emerge.
Astronomy, totally. And we're gonna see Copernicus as a part of this unfolding situation. So this time heralded the end of the Dark Ages, and it was the burgeoning enlightenment movement for several reasons. A big part of what happened here was the separation of the feudal church state into modern forms of government via the Church of England, Anglicanism, or the Protestant Reformation. And this it was instigated by revolutionaries like Martin Luther and others. We're going to talk about Henry VIII being a part of this. And it's an interesting thing to see because in some ways, history takes an ugly turn in order to do what it needs to do. It's like growing pains. We're going to see this all happening. And, this goes to say it was around the last Neptune-Pluto conjunction that the modern age began to emerge from the despondency of the Dark Ages. And this was, again, we can see that this was around the 1300s, and this is the exact thing that's happening in today's time. We see clashing themes of Neptunian individuation and religion versus Plutonian rule by mob force at play around this very important time in history. And it's interesting where Neptune is concerned, and even where Uranus is concerned throughout all this. We see that science and it was a big part of the church releasing its stranglehold of power over the citizenship. Neptunian freedom of spiritual liberty within the individual wrought havoc on the stranglehold of Plutonian power due to the Enlightenment era contributions of science, physics, astronomy, modern industry, and sociological movements for the people. So this is what we see kind of happening. First, in the 1400s, there's a bit of a wave that happens where Pluto, we know that Neptune just conjuncts Pluto in 1399. And then in 1430, Neptune's in the second from Pluto. And then, of course, in around 1453, this is around the time that Pluto is closer to the sun than Neptune. This happened at the exact same signs. Pluto is in the same signs, and Neptune was in the same place. It was in the third house away, the third house sextile in front of Pluto. Now, we can see that it was at this time, this is correlated with the 1960s, right? And we can see this because it was around this time, really, that the psychedelic revolution took place. And there was deep tension between power structures and individual sovereignty, liberty, and capacity to explore consciousness through whatever means is wanted. This happened in the 60s, and it happened around 1460s. Now we can see the lockstep continued, 1479. Now I would like to mention that we can see the world, we can't see it through the slide, but the world was bubbling at this time. Columbus entered the New World around 1493. Now, of course, the New World of the Americas had already been discovered and, trampled through by other people like the Vikings, like long before this. But this was the time when modern society and history started to stretch itself and expand itself out of the church feudal state of England and into other territories. I should say England and France really ruled the world of the modern world around this time. So 1493, Columbus enters the New World. Then in 1507, Pluto is in Sagittarius. By 1521, Pluto once again comes into Capricorn. And this kind of correlates with the recent age, although there's a bit of a gap. You know, Pluto here is 1521, it enters Capricorn. Pluto also entered Capricorn around 2009. So this date correlates with about 2009. And it was around this time that Martin Luther proposed his disputation on the power of indulgences, and he challenged Catholic dogma. 1517, we're going to see that Martin Luther really lit a fire that changed the way that the church had its stronghold on governing politics. Now, it's around this time that Pluto started leaving its proximity to the sun, and it starts getting away from the sun. Pluto starts moving slower, and Neptune starts catching up to the exact sextile of Pluto, having fallen behind from our perspective. Now, in this time, it was about 1535 that this sort of occurred, and it was in 1540 that Neptune bursted through the gates. In today's time, we know it's going to be about 2030 that Neptune bursts through the gates. And I would like to point out that Copernicus released his theory that the Earth revolves around the sun in 1543. We could almost correlate this to about 2030. You know, we could almost, you know, abiding by the predictive pattern, we could say something similar is going to happen around the 2030 era. So it's interesting to think about how these patterns correlate. And this is why I have this slide here. About 1540, Neptune is exactly sextiling Pluto. It's similar to 2026, where Neptune is exactly sextiling Pluto. So we note that Pluto goes through this with Neptune every 250 years. And that's the lockstep. That's trend number 2. Pluto appears to move faster compared to the Neptune because it's briefly closer to the sun. Now, this also occurred during the American Revolution in the 1770s, but trend number 1 was not. Trend number 1 being the conjunction of Neptune and Pluto. So, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Just to add in, like that cycle, like Pluto's orbit's 248 years, but the cycle they're lapping is about every 500.
Correct. That's right. So that's why it's significant that both of them occurring during this time in the 1400s and 1500s. We can see how indeed this may have brought about the Renaissance era and the end of the Dark Ages. So that was a very significant thing. Neptune-Pluto only happens every 500 years, and then Pluto being lockstep with Neptune, trend number 2, only happens about every 250 years. When they both happen together, there's significant things to be considered there. Does that make sense, Michael?
Absolutely.
Rightio. Now, the third trend is the pins of ignition. This is when the fuse is lit for these longer standing trends that we've been talking about with Pluto and Neptune. In particular, this is trend number 3. What we see, yeah, do you have a thought there, Michael?
I just wanted to just say to people that are Western astrologers that one of the reasons this is so key in your talk is the eclipses, is as your connection to Jyotish and the Hindu astrology, which really gives a lot of significance to the nodes.
Certainly.
And the eclipse points. So I just wanted to say that for people.
Thank you.
It's like I mean, we talk about it in all astrology, of course, but in Jyotish, this is really a key trigger points.
Certainly. Vedic Jyotish really considers the trigger point is the best way to put it. I think the modern Western astrological equivalent that gives this kind of credence to the nodes is evolutionary astrology, which is kind of the realm of Dane Rudhyar and Jeffrey Wolf Green. Evolutionary astrology also puts significant interest in the happenings of the nodes and of the eclipses.
Yep.
So thank you, Michael. I always appreciate you throwing in your wisdom. Now, here we have trend number 3. And this is when Pluto is in Capricorn or Aquarius, and the south or north nodes touch Pluto in Capricorn and Aquarius, and an eclipse happens. It's in the year that that occurs that something significant will happen, because eclipses tend to be the manifester. It is everybody knows during eclipse season, things get a little bit shaky. There's an urgency, and it's, to describe it would be, a whole video in itself. But the Jivatman of the moon and the Atman of the sun are coming together to really experience and embody what's in the soul regarding the material data that is outside. These north and south node eclipse points are the moments when whatever's been laid out by the outer planets and what have you, they come into manifestation for the souls of individuals who are pulled into the eclipse energy. Of course, it's always an individual that comes to some kind of breaking point, some kind of revolutionary breaking point that makes these things happen. And we can see that oftentimes when we look at the patterns of important eclipses, we notice that what kind of is happening here is that in the time leading up to the eclipse, you can see the dominoes are being laid out. Then the eclipse happens, and it's not usually on the exact date of the eclipse that things happen. It's simply something is triggered in the year or a year after or before an eclipse happens on a significant point. It's usually in the year that it happens, and we're going to see that correlated to the historical dates that we're looking at. And
with the new moon solar eclipses being initiators and the full moons being climaxes.
bingo.
And not just like, even though they come in pairs 2 weeks apart, the climax is from 6 months before.
Right.
So these are basically, the eclipses are the seed of the next year cycle and the next. So the full moon will be like the peak of the 6 months before, and then following through, and then the solar. So that this gives us a year period, basically.
Right. Thank you, Michael. That's basically what I was trying to convey there. So let's start looking at some dates so that we can see the general time periods that some important things would have been happening. The first one I've got here is the Protestant Reformation that was started by Martin Luther. Martin Luther's 95 Theses was released to churches and the people around 1517. And this was a disputation on the power of indulgences and invitations to debate Catholic dogma, which is you didn't question. We all these days, it's like, you don't question your grandfather. You let him smoke his cigars and he's going to do what he's going to do, and no one questions him. This was like that to a much higher degree in terms of what the church was. The church at this time, before the 1500s, was considered the intermediary between God and man. Martin Luther propounded the idea that only God could judge man, and a wealthy stateholder could not simply buy God's forgiveness. This was a time when the people who were in power, the bishops and these guys, could go and do silly things like rape a woman or rape a child or something like that, because they're trying to be, non-sexual, and then they could buy their forgiveness, and they will have the money because they're in the church and they have the power to. So the church could just do some very terrible things, and the people in that power would say, well, I had to because I'm holding a lot of power and I am the ambassador of God, so I'm going to give a bunch of money to the poor, and that way I'll be forgiven for my sins. And Martin Luther said that only God can have this true understanding and knowing of forgiveness in the heart of every individual, which means that the power in the church to judge in this way was kind of becoming nullified. This whole idea he was excommunicated for, but he ran in circles all around town in the general area. He was in what's now known as Germany, but Germany wasn't considered a nation until like the 1700s. So Martin Luther at this time put out his thesis on these ideas, and he was excommunicated, but he left a mark, especially because, as we'll see, at this time, the North Node, so this is June 19th, 1517. We see Pluto at this time had come up to Capricorn. It's just getting into the entrance of Capricorn. The North Node was in Cancer in 1517. There was a solar eclipse on the North Node, very close at this time. And it was in this year that Martin Luther was doing his thing. Pluto was with the South Node. You know, in Western charts, it doesn't show the South Node, it only shows the North Node. But we know that the South Node is here because the North and South nodes are complete opposites. So Pluto was right next to the South Node in Capricorn when this fire was ignited at this time. Now, I would like everybody to keep in mind that this was the same pattern that occurred in 2020, in which we had our recent global pandemic, where the Pluto was in Capricorn and the South Node was in Capricorn. And there was an eclipse in Cancer in 2019, and then there was an eclipse in Capricorn on the South Node in late 2019.
Oops,
and
you got the wrong chart.
Are you talking about well, I'm still showing the Protestant Reformation
Okay.
here at this time, but the same thing happened. I know I don't have it on me. I've got it somewhere in here.
I've got it in mine.
That's okay. I think I got it
I'll
right
show
here.
it later.
That's okay. This is it, 2019.
Yeah.
So this is the North Node in Cancer, and around December 25th, 2019, there was we can see again, the Western chart won't show it, but the South Node is here in Capricorn with Pluto and Saturn and Jupiter and the Sun and the Moon all in Capricorn at this time. And this kicked off the recent pandemic. So this same thing was happening around this time in 1517. And this is what started Martin Luther's thing. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go along. We see about 8.5 to 10 years later, we see the North Node has now crept up to Capricorn, right? 1517, the North Node was in Cancer. And then almost pretty much 10 years later, the North Node is now in Capricorn. And we see there's another North Node eclipse. This is a very partial eclipse that happened here, but it's still relevant. It happened in Capricorn. And this coincided with the Holy Roman Empire attacking Rome and imprisoning the Pope. Many people consider this to be the end of the Italian Renaissance era. This is a part of the growing Protestant movement, which was undercutting the autocratic rule of the Catholic Church, since Martin Luther started his revolts in Germany and all around. The sacking of Rome is just a classic thing that happened in history, and isn't it the craziest thing that it happened in the year that the North Node was in Capricorn while Pluto was there? Now, this next little phase here, I've got a few slides showing it. This is this character named King Henry VIII. By the year 1334, so again, this is about, another 10 years ahead, almost. This is more like really about 7 years. Yes, 7 years ahead. The North Node is now in Leo, and the South Node is in Aquarius. And by this time, Pluto had come into Aquarius. So what we see in January of 1534 is a South Node eclipse on Aquarius while Pluto is there. By 19, sorry, that should actually say 1534. That's another mistake that I got to deal with in this presentation. So by 1534, the south node had crept up back to Pluto again. This time while Pluto was in the sign of Aquarius. It's around 1534. One of the most historically, well, this is debatable, but a lot of people say that King Henry VIII was a very important king of England. He was kind of a pig of a guy in the latter part of his life, but he did make moves that created the modern form of government in England today. And this was what he did occurred in the midst of these Protestant reformations that were occurring, which were initiated by Martin Luther. So to give this short thrift, King Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage to his first wife because she would not bear him a male heir. And this is, of course, just how they thought in those days. King Henry VIII wanted a male heir. His wife wouldn't give him a male heir because she just kept having girls. So he threw her away like a used napkin and wanted to get married to another wife, and because he thought another wife would give him a better chance at a male heir. Now the church didn't agree to divorce. The Catholic Church didn't want him to divorce his first wife. So he did it anyway, and he went underneath the church's rule. And the church said that you can't do this. And King Henry basically said, you know what? Here's what's going to happen. I'm making a new form of power. While you guys are weak, while this Martin Luther reformations are happening, you guys just got sacked Rome just got sacked. You guys have no power anymore. So now King Henry says, I'm ushering in a new form of power called the divine right of kings. And this overthrew the power of the Catholic papacy, giving rise to English Protestantism. So King Henry VIII. So the Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared that the king was the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. And the Treasons Act of 1534 made it high treason, punishable by death, to refuse the oath of supremacy, acknowledging the king as the supreme power. All of the bishops and all of the clergy of the King of England at the time had to bow to the king as the new arbiter of power and law in England. This is taking the power out of the church's hands and into the hands of a monarchical state. And of course, yes, this did happen when Pluto was in Aquarius and there was a south node eclipse in Aquarius this year, 1534. So again, we see the intermingling themes of Neptunian truth and individual sovereignty, moving past Pluto's fixation of power, the papacy. Now, the kingship and government monarchy simply replaced the church at this time. It's not all that, the power didn't exactly come to the best place, but this was an important step in leading to contemporary forms of government, right? And we see this is trend number 3 is occurring. The eclipses occurred during Pluto's stay in Saturn-ruled Capricorn and Aquarius. And this is what prompts these big turns in the power structures of history. Now, just to fast forward to 1543, which is, of course, about 9 years later, we see Pluto is still in Aquarius, and the North Node has now come to Aquarius. In 1534, the North Node was in Leo. Now, about 9 years later, the North Node is in Aquarius with Pluto. This resonates with our time when Aquarius is going to have the North Node eclipse where Pluto is in February 2027 and 2028. In 2028, the North Node is going to be in Aquarius with Pluto, and it correlates to this time. It's, of course, this year, 1543, that Nicholas Copernicus released his groundbreaking theory of heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun. Of course, we can see that this caused repercussions to religion that were unheard of up till this point. And this is significant in terms of the conversation going on between Pluto and Neptune. And Pluto is triggered by the nodes in Aquarius while they were, as we know, we can see from this previous thing that was happening here, is that these two, Neptune was just starting to get past its sextile to Pluto. It was 1540 that Neptune broke through the Great Gate, as in trend number 2 that we were talking about. So we can see that these two overlapping in 1543 was what caused Nicholas Copernicus to release his theory that the Earth revolves around the sun. And this changed history in a way nothing else has since. So we can see the significations of important things happening at this time. So from here, this is a very much a reflection of what's happening in today's time. And this is what I've been wanting to speak to in this whole presentation. Now, I don't want to give too much thrift to the Great American Revolution. It's more important really for us to start talking about today's time.
Can I just share on
Yes,
that? Go back to that chart
sure.
and just take note for later how Pluto is in Aquarius and Neptune is in Aries.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's where we're headed.
Because that is what is happening and that is what is coming. Because we know that Pluto is coming into Aquarius in today's time and Neptune is coming into Aries. So this is some very significant things. Now, one thing that I'm going to talk about is that at this time, Saturn was in the sign of Scorpio. It's not Saturn's favorite place to be, but we can see how this is important because Saturn rules Aquarius. And it's kind of square to what's happening here, Saturn being square to Pluto and this solar eclipse happening here.
And I would add Uranus has just finished aspects with the two of them.
Right.
From Leo, so opposite Pluto and trining Neptune.
That's right. And that is very significant. So we're going to see how even Uranus plays a part in all these things. But the big trigger for me is the Neptune and Pluto cycle and Pluto in the sign of Aquarius, where these big material world changes are always going to take place. Now, in the 1770s, the Great American Revolution started. And of course, 1770 is about 250 years, just about. Really, it's 250 years after Pluto is in Capricorn. Let's say that's about 1527. Pluto is here in Capricorn. 250 years later is the Great American Revolution. When again, we know that America's birth chart has Pluto in Capricorn. And this is around the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So in the 1770s, trend 1 was not apparent because Neptune was in the 9th from Pluto. I say that this is not as significant as Neptune being conjunct Pluto, but it is still significant. Michael, you've actually mentioned to me since we've been discussing that the trine to Pluto is its own significant thing.
Yeah, it's actually connected very much with the sextile.
Right.
In their cycle, the sextile and the trine both last for that 80-year period, whereas everything else moves quickly. And interestingly, they're lockstepped in such a way that it's always the trine and sextile at this vast period of time that we're in. And we're not just talking hundreds of years, thousands, that whenever they hit those aspects, they last for 80 years.
Right.
So, and it is significant that the trine and sextile, I mean, this is, they're both energies where they can talk to each other. They can connect. They're not challenged by each other. So it gives, through this big part of time, that ability to really connect these two archetypes, if you will, of the spirit of transformation and really bring it into embodiment through what you're talking about, these more specific things that ground the big cycles.
That's right, Michael. That totally makes sense to me. And this is the point that we're talking about here. Now, I didn't make the typical presentation where, like I really like this little visualization where we can see Neptune comes to conjunct Pluto, and then Pluto, right around the time that Pluto's in Leo, it starts to come into this lockstep with Pluto, with Neptune. Now, when we look at this period of the Great American Revolution, Pluto is in Capricorn at this time, but it had just been lockstep with Neptune in this trine. We see right now at the present chart, this is 1775. Pluto is in Capricorn. Neptune is in the balsamic trine behind it in Virgo. Neptune and Pluto have been in lockstep just before the American Revolution. They were in lockstep for about 80 years. And this is trend number 2. Pluto coming closer to the sun than Neptune, right? So we see that trend number 2 is apparent at this time in the Great American Revolution. So really, not only is Pluto in Capricorn significant because Capricorn is ruled by Saturn as the material gate holder, but every time Pluto comes into Capricorn and comes into Aquarius, Neptune will have been in lockstep with it. In the case of this time, it was in a balsamic trine. In the case of today's time, it's in the same sextile that it was in the Enlightenment era. Now, the Great American Revolution started around April of 1775. This actually isn't the eclipse, but this is the date of the Great American Revolution starting, the official start date. We can see a few significant things that were happening at this time, including that Pluto is in Capricorn. Saturn was in Libra, interestingly. There was a grand trine between Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune around this time. And the North Node eclipse was in Virgo the year that this all started. Now,
take note that Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, grand trine again, because that's a repeat from the 3 planets coming in alignment in our last chart.
Right.
Coming up again.
Right. Revolutionary times. Now, the actual Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th. And then this is that chart. And I didn't make the actual eclipse chart for this, but this was the Declaration of the Independence, being signed. 2 weeks later, there was a partial solar eclipse in Cancer opposite Pluto. Although the North Node was in Leo, they were still close together. I don't know why I didn't make a chart for it. But I think it's basically because I wanted to show that this was the significant eclipse that has been leading to the Great American Revolution. It's January 8th, 1777. The eclipses occurred on the axis of Capricorn and Cancer while Pluto was in the late degrees of Capricorn. You can see the South Node would have been at the late degrees of Capricorn as well. And the sun and the moon were coming conjunct with Pluto, with the South Node in Capricorn. And again, this is just like the time of Martin Luther doing his big revolutionary thing on the church. And as well, this is just like the present time where we just recently had our pandemic. You see the same thing. Pluto with Capricorn, with the South Node, opposite the North Node. This was 1777, and then this was 2019. See, Pluto, the sun and moon are with the South Node in Capricorn. So there's a bit of a resonance there. Now, this is just quickly to show here that in February 8th of 1785, this was after, this was about, what was it? About 7 or 8 years afterwards. In 1783, the Great American Revolutionary War ceased with the Treaty of Paris. In 1785, the North Node solar eclipse occurred in Aquarius while Saturn was in late Capricorn. So what happened here is that around 1785, there was eclipse in Aquarius. And this is just like what's going to be happening in 2027, 2028. Pluto in Aquarius with the North Node occurring in Aquarius. It was at this time that the war ceased, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and America was officially birthed from its mother England. In 1785, while Pluto was in Aquarius and the North Node eclipses were occurring there, U.S. Congress unanimously announced to resolve the name of U.S. currency to the dollar and adopted a decimal coinage for the first time. So this was an important part of America becoming an individual and being birthed from the womb of England. This is when England and all of the European countries finally said, all right, the New World has its own thing going on. Nobody owns it. They are their own sovereign nation. And this was the birth of the monarchical democratic form of government that we really see happening around this time. And this wasn't just in America. Everyone was following suit with this democracy, at least in the modern world. I put in here that the Treaty of Hopewell between Confederation and the Cherokee people was also signed at this time, which was a gross statement of the continental settlers of America kind of tricking the native peoples of America. So that's kind of a sad thing that happened at this time. This goes to show that, sometimes these steps that are made forward are not always, they're like kind of painful steps sometimes. It's like the trauma that causes a child when he leaves home to be street smart and be able to survive on his own. It's not always the prettiest thing. It's significant to note that at the time that America finally gained its independence, Saturn was in the sign of Capricorn, while Pluto was in Aquarius, and this North Node occurred. This is going to be significant to today's time later when we see Saturn is going to be in Aries, and it's not a very happy place for Saturn to be while this Plutonian North Node eclipse in Aquarius is happening. We're going to see that in today's time. So this, Michael, we're finally coming up to our contemporary vision of what's happening in today's time. I haven't been watching the time. I'm sure we've gone over the hour that we planned for, but that's how she rolls. Now, we see 1840, Neptune's in the 11th. We see by 1891, Neptune conjuncted Pluto in Gemini. And then in the 50s, they got into their lockstep, which is trend number 2. And we can see by 1999, they were still in sextile. 2012, they were there. And then in 2026, technically close to 2030, Neptune breaks through the gates and appears to be moving faster than Pluto from Earth's perspective. Now, this is where Uranus comes in the modern vision of what's happening in this whole thing. Uranus was conjunct Pluto. We know that Uranus moves much faster than these two other transpersonal planets. Uranus was conjunct Pluto in Taurus in 1851. It was trine Pluto in 1885. It was opposite Pluto in 1903. It was in a balsamic trine to Pluto in 1922. And then it came over, and in 1965, this is the generation of people for whom Uranus was conjunct Pluto. 1993 is the generation of Uranus being conjunct Neptune. Now, by this time, 2012, Uranus is square to Pluto, and now Uranus is leading the pack. By 2023, Uranus is trine Pluto and sextile Neptune, quite precisely. And it's around this time that we see that the kite is forming and what is happening and what's coming in today's time. So we've talked all about the long-term trends of Pluto and Neptune. Now we're going to look at the short-term trend of how Uranus is going to be involved in this situation in today's time. Uranus trine Pluto, sextile Neptune. This is all occurring in feminine signs. We see by 2025, all of these characters are going to be pouring into the masculine signs, pretty much all around the same time. Although, of course, these are outer planets, which means they're going to kind of tap dance on the cusp of the signs for a while before, they all go through retrogrades and all these sorts of things before they finally officially come into the masculine sign. around 2025, they're all kind of officially going to be in there. And this is the formation of a kite, as we've mentioned, which means that any points, really even in 2023, when these guys are in feminine signs, if anybody has natal points to the end of Virgo, and whenever any planet transits the end of Virgo, they're going to be sucked into some outer planet energy from this kite formation. The same thing will be occurring when these planets are in masculine signs in 2025, and any transits occur to the beginning of Libra.
Good point.
Thank you. Now, what we see happening here, this is just showing what's going on with the north nodes. In July of 2019, we saw that there was a conjunction, really, the south node was in Capricorn with Pluto, and this was the pandemic that we all know started around this time. There was also another south node eclipse in July of 2020, and this was also when Jupiter and Saturn were conjunct in Capricorn. So there's a lot combining here. All things considered, as wild as the pandemic was, it's interesting to note that Saturn was in its own sign of Capricorn. It was conjunct the great benefic Jupiter. So while there was a lot of devastating changes and destruction that happened at that time, there is significations of rather hopeful things that occurred at that time. Now, as the nodes are traveling, we see in 2021, it's the Gemini-Sagittarius axis. This is the year at present that me and Michael are making this presentation. We see that the North Node is conjunct Uranus in Taurus. So interesting things are happening in today's time with relation to Taurus by Uranus being here, and the eclipses are really triggering it. We see the LGBT and Saturn. Saturn would be in Aquarius. Thank you, Michael.
Squaring Uranus.
Squaring Uranus, yes. And that's significant because Saturn's in Aquarius and it's its own sign. And it's square to Uranus here. And thank you for pointing that out, Michael. So, we see the LGBTQ movement happening in today's time. There's a lot of difficult, but ultimately liberating consciousness with relation to all things Taurus. Mm-hmm. Personal gender, personal identity, even monetary things. Bitcoin is an interesting question mark that's kind of coming through the gate around this time. Bitcoin kind of is a governmentless currency, which relates to the sovereignty theme that we're kind of talking about. Now, in 2023, Pluto is Pluto is coming into Aquarius, and it's starting to dance on the line of Aquarius and Capricorn. The solar eclipse is happening in Aries, and that's around the time that's happening in this year. Now, 2024 is basically the same thing. There's going to be another eclipse in Aries. 2025, there's going to be an eclipse in Pisces, and I believe Neptune is going to still be in Pisces around this time. It's kind of tap dancing again right at the edge.
So Pluto is firmly in Aquarius.
Yes, Pluto for sure. Neptune is dancing on the edge, and it's interesting to think of what is going to be brought through spiritually around the time of February 2025 and February 2026. And really, it's around 2026. I should show it. Sorry?
Yeah, there's a very interesting, just as a complete aside.
Yeah, for sure.
When Saturn and Neptune come together at the very last degree,
you got it.
Pisces in 2025 will be a key moment, not exactly connected to what we're talking about, but significant.
It will be significant for sure, especially because Pluto is in Aquarius and it's being channeled through its dispositor, Saturn. Yep. And the North Node is going to be tapping on Saturn while it's with Neptune. For me, the significations there are very interesting. Thankfully, at this time at least, Saturn doesn't do too bad in Pisces. It's not its favorite place. It's a little bit wishy-washy for Saturn's thing, and it's with Neptune. So there's going to be the paint is going to be about the wettest it's going to be at that point. And it's the same thing around 2026, but at this time in 2026, Saturn is coming into Aries. And Neptune is probably, I really should have put that it's probably pretty much in Aries at this time too, 2026. I would have to check that for sure. Now it's around 2026 that all three of the planets are really going to be there. Uranus is tap dancing on the edge here as well, and is probably pushing into Gemini by this point. Now, it's significant to note that in February 2027, the North Node will be in Aquarius, Neptune will be with Saturn in Aries, and Uranus will be in Gemini. And this is this funky sort of pattern that's kind of happening here.
And Neptune is in Aries.
Yes, Neptune is in Aries at this point for sure.
At 2020, no, 2026.
It is in 2026. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for clarifying that for me. So I wonder if it's going to be there by February, because this could just mean that in February of 2026, the North Node will be in Pisces.
I believe it will. It'll be dancing the edge.
Right. That's what I think too. So there will still be significations, I think, of Neptune in Pisces there. But it'll be dancing on the edge. So it's kind of a cuspy sort of thing going on here. But we know for sure by February 2027, Neptune and Saturn will be Saturn will kind of be well into Aries. Neptune will be in Aries, and Uranus will be in Gemini, and Pluto will be in Aquarius with the North Node. And this is the first eclipse that we see here, which is significant in its own way. And we can see that, let's see, this is the slide I'm kind of looking for here. This is the final slide that I have in my presentation. And it's significant that Pluto is in Aquarius. There's going to be a North Node eclipse with Pluto in Aquarius in February of 2028. And the dispositor, Saturn, will be in Aries with Neptune, which means Neptune is going to be kind of amplifying Saturn while it is at its most vulnerable in the sign of Aries. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to this whole presentation, is because the paint will be wet, but the artists will be dealing with a lot of mental and physical and financial and economical anguish at this time, especially because Neptune is there. How I've described this, Michael, this is basically the point where I'm going to start giving you the reins for this conversation. How me and my astrology friends have framed this is that it's kind of in terms of sovereignty that we're talking about. You know, when the American Revolution happened, America gave the middle finger to Mother England and was birthed. And Saturn was kind of in Capricorn at the time. They had the capacity to do that. If we correlate today's time with sovereignty, with the sovereignty of the individual, what's kind of happening is that the individual sovereignty of every individual is going to have this desire to say, you know, to give the same finger to some kind of global corporatocracy mother that is taking the form of what England was. And it's as if we're leaving home. The individual, just like America left home and had to develop and strike out on the streets and make its own life happen, individual sovereignty is being birthed in this time. We are leaving home, but what's happening is it's as if we're leaving home while we're in the middle of like a ghetto or some kind of economical difficulty is happening. The Neptune theme that one of the astrologers I was talking about this with mentioned that it's as if the kid has left home in a bad part of town and has gotten into drugs. It's a very interesting and amusing sort of situation. Now, again, I'm an optimistic person. I think that whenever things like this have to happen, I mean, sometimes they've got to happen. Sometimes difficulties bring the goodness that we all expect. Now, do you have any thoughts in terms of this? I mean, really, I've gotten
You're
to the
bursting
end of
forth.
Yeah, no kidding. There's a lot going on there, you know?
I've got lots of thoughts, so.
Wonderful. Okay, Michael. So you can feel free to speak to what I just mentioned in terms of the the
Yeah.
kid coming out onto the street, or you can just you can take the reins here, my friend.
Well, I've got a number of things to share now. I'm going to share a chart.
Please. Oh,
I'll
I better check to make
disable the
sure. Yep, there you
screen
go.
sharing.
You should be able to now, Michael.
Okay, let's try this. Just share just a few charts. So earlier you were asking about Neptune, whether it was already. So this is July of 2026.
Beautiful.
It's not a specific date. It's just a general time, but I wanted to show this mini grand trine, if you will, a kind of semi-grand trine is the way I kind of in my mind
Right.
think of it, where we have Pluto in Aquarius, Uranus in Gemini, and Neptune in Aries. So this is all the stuff has been kind of leading to this point, and I'm going to come back to the slides in a second, but I'm just going to talk to this in a bit. Couple things to note for me: the Uranus and Gemini coming around. Remember, I kept interrupting and going.
Yep. This
Recognize that
yep.
part. Recognize that. So if we have here, we have again Uranus coming in to this dance between Neptune and Pluto. So here it's exact again, right?
Right.
And at the time that these have come into their last kind of exact part of their dance, where they're going to hang out here for a couple of years lockstep. Uranus is coming again, as it had in those past times that you'd brought up, and creating a, Uranus is all about like a spark to initiate something, to make it happen. And of course, we have Saturn that has just come out of its conjunction with Neptune, which we were just talking about. So Gemini, this Gemini theme is really key here, because if you look back at all the conjunctions between the Neptune and Pluto for the last thousands of years, like a couple thousand, every 2,500 years, they kind of change signs that they come together in approximately.
Right.
So for 2,500 years ish, they've been in Gemini. Every time they have a conjunction, they're in Gemini.
So that was in 1890 as well as
1891 was in Gemini.
Right.
And so was the one before.
Right.
And
the 1300. There was about 1399.
Yes. So here we have this Gemini theme. And Uranus is coming in from Gemini, triggering them. And so it's a kind of hot point. And why there's many small things we could talk about with that, but the big thing I want to point out, and I want to kind of go backwards a little bit to this period that we're in now, started with this strong Capricorn. It's almost like the birth canal, Capricorn, Saturn. It's like that squeeze that you have to move through to be born into something new, into the material world.
For sure.
It's the Saturn Capricorn energy on some levels. And with the pileup, with Saturn, Pluto hitting at the beginning of the pandemic, Jupiter coming in, exploding it around the world. And as we know, where that squeeze kind of ended, but began really what it's all about, was Saturn and Jupiter coming together at 0 degrees of Aquarius for their first time. So I mentioned how Pluto and Neptune have been coming together in Gemini all these times, every time they have a conjunction. So Saturn and Jupiter, though they cycle every 20 years, have a bigger cycle of 200, where they come together in signs of the same element for 200 years, and then they shift, and then for the next 200 years, a different element. So we've just gone through an element shift from Earth for the last 200 years into air, starting with, interestingly, 0 degrees of Aquarius.
Right.
So
Right.
here we have 0 degrees of Aquarius, this hot point. Jupiter and Saturn are a society's themes. Every
Hmm.
20 years, it's like the generational shifts as well, but with the 200-year cycle, these bigger cycles within it of these
Hmm.
themes. So we've had an Earth-based one, the Industrial Revolution, and this
Oh
more
yeah. Cool.
materialistic way of being,
Right.
moving into air.
Aquarian and
This
airy.
Aquarian ruled air-based cycle of technology and information and communication. Very different. So again, we were talking about the shift that you've pointed out between the um, moving into the all masculine sign. So we're moving from earth, feminine in terms
Hmm.
of archetypes of earth, into the masculine archetype of air. So
All
this
while, yeah.
so this is started on the solstice of 2020 and has been going for the past year and a half.
Hmm.
Jupiter zipped on. It's now 0 degrees Aries. That's a whole significant thing for a whole other talk.
Hmm.
But Saturn has been slowly moving through Aquarius during this time, squaring the very Aquarian Uranus in
Mm.
the very Earth Taurus.
Right.
So here's this Earth energy. We're just finishing with it, but we've had this lineup of Capricorn and Uranus going through Earth. It's like the last hold of that energy.
The last hold of the earth and
So
feminine energies that have been here.
yeah, so what I'm seeing is what's been happening now. Like you mentioned, there's some positive, everything in astrology is neutral. It's what we do with it and how we perceive it.
Nice. Thank you.
So it's like on the bigger scale, looking out, we are just going through a major shift from an old energy into a new energy.
Hmm.
And right now, everything we're going through is that shift. And
Hmm.
so if you look at it from a bigger perspective, yeah, these old energies are holding on for dear life.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to really let go, especially Earth. It's the most
Mm.
solid and
Yeah.
materialistic. But we're moving. There's no matter what we think it should be, the energy is moving forward. And it
Mm.
is, and what you've exposed here in your presentation is just a great expose of how potent this is, because we already have these signs that I've been describing and others showing this kind of shift. Now, the 0 degrees Aquarius point and moving into the next 200 years ruled by Aquarius is not the age of Aquarius.
Hmm.
But we are already moving into that age. It's obvious. We're in a very technological age since like the 80s ish.
Hmm.
I mean, it's just been building, building, building. And in some ways, though the pandemic's been hard, just on a practical, earthy level,
Hmm.
and the financial thing is not over yet, because this energy is not over yet.
Yeah.
We have
Agreed.
another year of this energy moving through, in my opinion. I mean,
Hmm.
who am I? But it's just that's what it feels like. That until what you're showing is going to happen, we're still in this old energy hanging on as the new energy is trying to push forward.
Right. Breaking
And
through an egg of sorts.
the key of it to me, partially because of the Saturn Jupiter cycle and many other things, as well as this Age of Aquarius thing and this Uranus thing added to it, we are moving into a very Aquarian style thing. And that is
Right.
really nailed down by Pluto entering Aquarius.
And really all this
It's
trine, the base of the kite moving into these
exactly.
masculine
So we
signs.
have this very potent time of this sextile where there's just a connection, a smooth relationship between Neptune and Pluto,
Mm.
which faded for a bit. So it was very strong, and then it faded since 2000-ish
Hmm.
until, and it's building again. And that there's a lot of seeds of possibility that it holds. And as you've shown in your charts, how all these
Hmm.
like really potent things are happening, especially as it relates to the individual's freedom. Neptune, like breaking free, direct connection to the divine.
Mm.
Neptune
Bingo.
with Pluto is direct connection to the divine. There's
For
no
sure.
interface. There's no Saturn. There's no structure.
There's
It's
no
like,
infrastructure. Right.
and Uranus is just like the revolutionary. Yeah, like we got to break down that old structure and reconnect our our psyches back to source and be able to
Mm,
act and move through there. So there's this theme, of course, the material world's slow to act, and like we're finding new and new ways. And I love how you've built this story where we've got this
mm-hmm,
revolutionary energy that's breaking down the church, creating
mm-hmm.
new ways of governing the democracies of the world. And that's building towards something. And we're at a crisis point of it all.
Right.
A
It's
lot
interesting to
of
think
this
about.
kind of old energy trying to pull in terms of the materialistic stuff and the control, and the energy is bursting forth into the individual, and you see it everywhere, but it's also being manipulated. So the kind of fake news and what's real, and
Right.
like, so you've got all this good information coming through that's then being kind of confused, Neptune.
Right. For sure. For
And of
sure.
course, right now we have Neptune and Pisces. Jupiter's dipping back in. You've got a Mars station in Gemini squaring it. So we're at a peak of kind of confusion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to see these big cycles for what they could be, but they are very there. And
Right.
we're really moving into a gateway period. Once Pluto hits Aquarius in 2024 fully, we're going to start to really ground in this Aquarian air
Right.
energy.
That will be the
And
first flag.
Neptune comes in, Uranus comes in. Uranus comes in 2026, dips in 2025. But Uranus coming into the Gemini, triggering all this, and it come with this kite triangle. It's like this, to me, when I tune into it, it's just like this high frequency, innovative energy. Like you
Mm-hmm.
talked about the Renaissance. I mean, this is a definite Renaissance energy.
For
This is
sure. For sure.
innovation of technology that's, there's going to be things that we haven't even dreamed of yet coming through.
That's right. And the
And things
implications
are
of it are wild.
already moving quickly, but it's going to move super quickly once these three hit the masculine signs of the Aries and Aquarius and Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
And the importance, as I mentioned, with this Gemini energy kind of cycling back, that it's sort of a rulership of this whole cycle on some level, that information and the ability to connect and direct connect. I Yes, there's some challenges involved, and a lot of people I see talk about with without seeing the big picture. I see a lot of people freaking out about Neptune and Aries being war. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Neptune has problems with boundaries, and it's Aries, so yes, there can be
Mm-hmm.
aggression and boundary issues that can create war.
Saturn being there.
Um, the last time Uranus was in Gemini, it was during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And it probably resonates with the Neptune
there's
Pluto
a
conjunction that you
resonance with
mentioned.
fear around this. I can understand that that's a possibility in the big picture, as there's certainly in the United States, like it's Pluto return from the Sibley chart, that the signing of the Declaration of
Mm-hmm.
Independence has happened this past year,
Right.
and it's
You can
still
see a
in it,
lot of that
still
happening.
in it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's not a lot of countries that last this long, or entities that last this long. So if you look at the Roman Empire, they did two Pluto returns before they popped
Or
off.
they popped off.
And the first one was big changes of power, and like one emperor after another getting executed, and
Right.
kind of chaos before it restabilized in a new form. And then the second one, it died about 10 years after. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's not necessarily the end of the United States, but it's the end of it as we
As we
know it.
know it.
It's a new form
Like when you
that's
think of the
connected to
things.
its old.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you mentioned, that there's a whole period in there. It's not just the sign of Declaration of Independence. There's like the Treaty of Paris. So that's an Aquarius energy.
Right.
Go in
Right.
Aquarius. So this new energy does have an alignment with the United States new form, and it
Mm-hmm.
could take this in a really positive direction.
Mm-hmm.
It could also go dark for a while. In the meantime, I don't really want to predict a specific, but I want to
Right.
see it in people's minds the possibility that this could be amazing.
I think
There's
so,
a lot
Michael.
of potential through the big cycle of it.
Mm-hmm.
In the smaller sense, it's a rough ride because the old is shaking up, the new isn't formed yet,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it's scary to let go of the old. And there's a huge, the earth is cozy. It's like it's solid.
You're
And
right.
we're letting that go and moving into a realm we don't understand. And it's very airy, it's very technological.
So we're moving out of that root chakra in a certain way.
In a way. And it to me, it's like, I mean, I've got a mind for technology, but I'm not super into it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But looking at these transits, I get as scared as anybody about AI taking over and all these
Right.
sort
Right.
of
Right.
things,
Right.
and like how many, seeing all the kids, like, but it's going somewhere. Like you
How I,
can't resist that there is some new form of a way of being and a new way of society and a new way of connecting. I
Mhm.
do believe the the earth elements in a crisis point, like the earth, I
Mhm.
mean, the whatever you want to call it, climate change or just the toxicity of the planet from the industrial revolution
Right.
has peaked. I mean, we
Definitely.
can't keep going. It's
Yeah.
so, you know, so there's a natural shift, and I believe that the technology is going to shift in a way where clean energy, even possibly free energy, if it can really break through,
Well,
uh,
there's so many things to think about
definitely,
here.
yeah, and definitely technologies to clean up the oceans and the
Right.
plastics. Like Neptune is water, right? So
Right.
Aries, like, yeah, it could be war, but it could also be like going gung ho with like creating technology to clean up the oceans. There could be
Yeah.
water wars. There could be people fighting over water. There probably will
Right.
be, but
Yeah.
there's also going to be technologies to clean water and to
Hmm.
disseminate water better.
Well, it's interesting that the Vedic people consider there's a deep metaphor behind Aquarius being the water bearer and being an air sign. What they say is that there's a yeah, cheers to the water as well for sure. And so the idea of Aquarius as this water bearer, the Vedic people consider that Aquarius is the instigator of sources of clean water for everybody in a communal area. And the people who do that aren't necessarily getting personal reward for it, but they're making the whole world better, and their lives will be easier if they institute this new water as well. This
Mhm.
could come in the form of like these days, everybody gets off work at lunch and they all go individually drive to McDonald's and get their own individual little cheeseburgers, and they get their own little individual packaging and all these sorts of things. This could be coming into a time where everybody, like, it's this more of a communal thing.
That's exactly what I was leading towards. Yes.
Right, right.
So I believe from my read of the energy is all of this is leading to an Aquarian themed thing
Mm-hmm.
with
Mm-hmm.
Gemini. And the Aries Neptune is just instigating it. And Neptune being a communal energy in of its own right. I I believe after this transition, it's just going to look ridiculous. It's like the idea of individual wealth and being hugely like wealthy and powerful, like the kind
We're
of
gonna laugh at it.
superstars of today are all like, the Elon Musks and the Amazons and Jeff Bezos, like those are the superstars of today. That's just
Right,
pure materialism.
right, right.
I think after this transition, that's gonna look ridiculous.
Yeah,
Like
and it's
people are
already
like,
happening where people today, the big stars is, people I'm a musician, and there's no big rock stars like there was in the
"Mm,
60s and 70s and 80s. What's happening is the big rock stars is somebody who's got a phone making a very clever little way of showing themselves doing
mm,
something as a trendy thing that nobody else is doing. How I've been describing this, it's a painful thing, but at some level, it's instigating a dismantling of the rock star ego that we've
yep,
known, especially from the Pluto and Leo era.
yep,
So many
yep,
rock stars came out of that era.
yep, yep,
Now it's more of an Aquarian theme
yep,
where the way I'm describing it is I'm thinking of light pollution, When you look out in the sky right now, you can see the stars, and they're individual little dots of stars. A lot of the background stars, you can't see them. It's black. And that's why we see the stars in the front. What's going to happen in the coming days is light pollution, where everyone's a star, which means nobody is. But at that point, there's going to be, individuation is going to be the craved for thing at a certain level.
Yeah.
Um, I see this happening. And in terms of what we mean in terms of sovereignty, coming out of the Earth phase, because you've mentioned that Saturn and Jupiter were conjunct in Aries after having conjuncted in Capricorn.
Aquarius.
I'm
Aquarius.
sorry, I meant Aquarius. Thank you, Michael. I'm so glad you pay attention to my voice. These planets conjuncted in Aquarius, which means the new Aquarian thing, and as well the sort of grand trine coming out of the feminine signs and all coming into the masculine air signs. What I see kind of happening is something especially related to the banks, the earthiness of banks being sifted into something new. There's the millennial in me is like, I haven't gotten into Bitcoin or anything like that. The implications of it not being owned by any bank, not being owned by any government, not having anyone's item code on this digital form of currency. I see so much positive and negative. And for this part of our video, this is kind of what we're wrapping with. I think of an extreme example that shows a glimmer of what's happening, and I think it's a negative one, but there are positive implications to it. Think of China, for example, and how China rolls with this social credit system. They have a very strange thing going on where everybody is got a name and a number in the digital registry. And this, I think, can show the negative connotations of this sort of thing, where for example, if a journalist, let's say something happens in a totalitarian government and the journalist doesn't like it. Like, let's say a bunch of powerful bureaucrats take the land of a bunch of peasants and allow robots to make the rice or the plantations instead of the peasants and people who have lived there for all those years. Those people were making money and having a good, rich human life. Now AI robots are doing it for them. And a journalist,
We will be seeing a lot of that type of thing.
for
Go
sure.
on.
For sure. And a journalist wants to come out and speak against the government and say, I think these powerful bureaucrats are trying to fill their own pockets with money and ruining the lives of these people. This journalist can get zapped out of the system.
Yep.
Where he can't even go and buy bread because now his debit card, which could possibly become the only currency at some level in this coming time, this person can't even go buy bread because this journalist has spoken against the autocratic rule of the bureaucrats that are ruling the system. I think that things like that are going to possibly happen. I don't know. But what could happen is that there will be an implosion where the idea of this network of virtual data registry will still be there, I think, in the future, but there won't be a power that can lock you out of it in the same way. That's my optimistic vision of this happening.
Well,
what do you think of that?
Well, I 100% align with what you're saying. I mean, it's kind of where I was heading in that this is a revolutionary energy. It's very new. There's a lot of positive to it and a lot of negative.
Right.
It's definitely on the lines of the communal.
Right.
So we've had a lot of right-wing materialistic individualism. And though what I find is interesting is like the transition that you made in your presentation, it is all moving towards the individual and an individual power. And that is what's interesting to me, because that's Aquarius. Aquarius is both the communal and the individual. It's like the uniqueness of the individual as part of the whole is Aquarius. And so there's this true individuation, whereas Leo individuation is like, I'm the king and I'm special and everyone else isn't. And
Mhm.
but that's also leadership, and it can be very important too.
Right.
They
Right.
all are, and it's self-expression in its pure way without giving a shit what anyone thinks.
Mhm.
Um, and it's ideal.
Yes. Yeah.
Aquarius kind of goes, yeah, okay, so pure expression, but let's disseminate that to everybody. So everybody has that equally. There's no rock star. It's like Andy
Yeah.
Warhol's 15 minutes of fame idea,
Yeah.
which
It's the
definitely it's already
exaltation.
here and it's getting more and more like that.
Yeah. I
And
almost see it as I always say, like a wrestler. Imagine a wrestler trying to say to himself, I'm the best wrestler in the world. That's like the Leo. No one's a better wrestler than me. But then it's like, okay, go out and do it with the other wrestlers and see how you are regarded in the social field that you're
and then
trying to consider.
I think Aquarius takes it one step further
Right.
and
Right.
goes, okay, wrestler, sit down with this intellectual and have an intellectual battle.
Aha.
So
Cool.
it's like everything is part of, it's not just I'm the best at this. It's like, yeah, you are the best at that. And this
Mhm.
person's the best at this, and this is the best at that. This is like the positive pinnacle of the Aquarius, Aries, Gemini kind of thing.
Mm.
Um,
Cool.
but yes, technology is happening. The powers that be are using it. There is all the things that you and I fear are kind of, like installed chips and all these things. I mean, they're
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
possible at
Right.
this stage. I mean, the technology and the explosion of it, and what what we're already starting to see. I mean, we're already all tracked to a certain extent. I mean, every credit card has a chip, every car has a chip, every
Mhm.
phone, everything is in a network, and that's just going to explode into something much bigger.
The
And
surveillance
it's
state
easy to
type
be
of thing.
afraid of it and just go right into 1984 surveillance state.
Right.
We're
Right.
fucked
Right.
from our old perspective.
Right.
But
Right.
that's but from the new perspective of us coming together, there could be a way of coming into a very positive. Now, one of the things that comes to mind when I think of this is, oh, geez, what's his name? Um, oh, I lost. But um, did a
That's okay.
series of films. He was like 100 years old from Florida. Did a series of films about like the way we could potentially work together and have cities, and would design whole new ways of cities, and like there would be like the central hub, and there would be very little
Mm.
ownership. Like we'd all, like if we need a tool, we just go get the tool, we bring it back. We don't need to
Right.
own everything ourselves. We don't all need to have our individual hamburger pack, as you said.
Yes,
Like
bingo,
there's
bingo. There
like
could just be a table and it's this big thing, and we can order, like you
we
got a little
share.
digital thing that says, I'd like to order this, and it gets put there, and it's not a cheeseburger owned by McDonald's. It's not a piece of sushi owned by Matsumoto brand
Yeah,
sushi. You put it in and it comes to your thing from the communal thing
energy.
that's happening,
Yeah.
and it's voila, and nobody owns it, and we've been contributing to everybody's food thing in this way. This
And
is
we
the
all
Aquarian
contribute
energy.
our own talent and our
Right.
own thing. And so it's not like, oh, you have to work for a bank because it's, well, actually, no, you are an artist, so you can do that.
Right.
And okay, you like numbers, so you can do that. Like there could be a dissemination of these things. I believe there's an ultimate neutrality to it all.
Yes,
It's
I agree.
important to understand where it's moving so we don't just kind of try and fight it, because
Hmm.
what we're seeing right now in our world is the collective fighting this transition.
I
Fact
agree.
is,
This is the earth holding and
transition,
the air is trying to.
yeah, and the air's pushing through.
Right.
It's coming. So it's not like we can say it's bad, because it
Hmm.
is. So how do we work with it to make it more positive?
Yes.
And so there's a very Renaissance like energy that, yeah, the church thought it was terrible that they discovered that the earth goes around the sun, and it blew apart their whole way of thinking. And
Right.
all
Right.
these things that we take for granted now, we're totally like, I mean, Galileo is thrown in prison, and
Right.
I mean, it's like it was scary to the powers that be at that time, and therefore the
Mhm.
common people who believed the powers that be that this was the devil and
Right,
evil,
right.
and
But it
so
came through.
but it came through, and it was a huge time of bursting through this newness and new
Hmm.
technology and new ways, the printing press, the
Mm,
dissemination of knowledge to the individual for the first time came
right.
at that time. Like, and now we have all this Gemini stuff, the dissemination. Right now, we're in a confused place with all, like, what's real with it.
Mm,
Um, I think that there's going to be some settling with all that. I'm not sure how that's going to take part, but I do
yeah.
feel like we will come into a more Wikipedia like sort of thing where there's a kind of
Singularity,
collective
collective.
way of sifting through the crap
Like
versus
how,
just somebody telling you like this is real and this isn't, and
yeah, yeah.
everybody like saying, coming up with their own ideas that can be so out there that, and used to manipulate people. I mean, and there is that. I mean, that's
Mm,
real with all the Gemini strength here. That's very real. But I think as Neptune moves out of Pisces, where though it's its home,
mm.
it's swimming in this, like, what's real? Who cares? Just like as
Right,
long as it
right,
feels good.
right.
Neptune in Aries is just like, all right, we got to get real. Like,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
is
yeah.
like,
We are instigating what's happening here right
yeah. And
now. Yeah,
so
yeah.
what do we, what world do we want to create is a big
Right.
question with this energy. I think it's a good one to leave people with. It's like we have
Beautiful,
an
Michael.
opportunity here to create the new world. The
Hmm.
energy is, it's almost like there's this collective funnel waiting to come through the people that are open to it with new technology, new
Hmm.
art, new ways of being, new ways of thinking that are beyond our problems and
Right.
can give solutions to our problems from outside of the problem.
I think
To
that
be
it's
open to
important.
that.
Yes, I think it's important to take any fear that could possibly happen in this burgeoning time in context, in the same that way that we can always see it in context, just as we did in the Enlightenment era, where there were the hands that be, the powers that be at the time, were trying to keep their strong stranglehold on the energy and momentum of what type of power they had all this time. I think that it's wise for us all to consider that there will be a holding on. It will be coming from us individually, and it will also be coming from the powers that be who have been used to a certain, you're on the bottom and I'm on the top. And they are going to want to stay on the
Oh
top,
yeah.
whatever that exactly means. And
They're going to
just
want to
like,
try and manipulate these energies to their own
right,
thing, which
for
is
sure.
where all the fear of, like, the Chinese control and the,
Right.
with the point systems and stuff. I mean,
Hmm. But how I see it happening is that just like how there were big revolts in the 1500s, there was
mhm.
much craziness that went on, but the data came through, the realizations, the transmissions, the writers, the artists, the art, the astronomers at the time were all underground. They were all in cahoots. They were all shaking each other's hands behind closed doors while the public sphere of the church ruled feudal state said, hey, don't be sneaking around doing astrology. And it all was happening underground. And the truth keepers retained their light even while everything was being buried underground. And I think that this was a phenomenon that had to be birthed because of the astrological events that we saw taking place as we've described. And I think it's going to be the same, but I think that there is going to be pushback from those who are invested in the past.
Yeah.
But after that period happens, we should all be looking forward to the fact that what is coming through is not necessarily an elite power core trying to enslave the planet. What's happening is that we're 18 and 19 years old. We have the ability to leave home, and they're afraid of us leaving home. And we have to just kiss mom and dad and say, I love you, but we have to do this. There's a new
Yeah.
form coming. And when the kid gains power, the parents are afraid for letting go of all that they've built on.
Exactly.
But this is a classic generational struggle between the youth and the older generations, just like it was in the 60s and 70s and any time.
It is, and it's each generation, and as we just showed, there's bigger cycles within the smaller ones, and this is one of the bigger generational cycles to a new.
Hugely.
And so I mean, just imagine if you lived at the time of Martin Luther and you were just in the village, you'd hear everybody freaking out, like, who's this guy? And like, it's threatening our way of being. Or if you were living in England and like Henry VIII, I mean, like, who's this crazy guy? And he's like getting rid of our church and he's changing it all.
Right,
Or
right.
imagine you're signing the Declaration of Independence. You're like, oh my God, what
Are we
have
doing
we done?
this? Are we doing this, dude? Yeah, for sure.
All hell's gonna break loose. Like,
right.
And yet it worked out.
Yeah.
And yet it also had problems, and it's still growing, and it's still working out. It's still working out. Like, we're on a much bigger journey. We're not going to see the end of these cycles.
That's right. Yeah.
So the best thing we can do is transform ourselves with it.
Bingo.
Not worry so much about what the outer world's doing and not doing. It's like,
be in tune with
how are you going to let yourself be transformed by this new way of being and new energy coming?
And that's, I love leading on this note here, Michael, in terms of anytime that social flux happens, just like the alchemical flux of turning lead into gold, there's always an uncomfortable peeling that goes on. So if we can allow ourselves to have the experience of maintaining the Agni, the fiery, a nice Vedic word, the heat of transformation. If we can face that for ourselves and teach our children and future generations to face and feel the uncomfortable heat of transformation, then when the transformation comes, we will be chasing its tail and it won't be chasing our tail.
We'll be creating it.
Right.
Like, if you go with the inspiration possible, especially if these planets land on a personal point in your chart,
right,
it's a key thing to look at. What do you have at 0 Aquarius and 0 Aries and beginning of Gemini, and how is this movement affecting you? Where do these planets, at what stage do they hit you, and what happens to you in that part of your life? It's not like you have to figure it out. It's like, when that happens, your life will bring it. Neptune will hit, and all of a sudden you'll lose everything, or maybe not. Maybe you'll just be inspired. Maybe you'll be super emotional. Depends on your soul, your path, and what it's hitting. But there's going to be a surrender,
for sure.
Go with that surrender. It's going to take you to a nugget of magic.
And I think it's a good thing for people in this coming age to consider that it's important to surrender to the energy, and not necessarily to always surrender to the power structures that might not be holding the authentic energy. They might be holding on to past energy.
And not even the authentic story.
Right. Bingo.
They're giving Michael a story that's designed to create fear. There's another story that we can live, that we can feel, that the astrology is showing on a much bigger scale. And that's what's exciting about this talk and everything that's happening here, because there's I like the Agni image, because Neptune in Aries has being fanned by the air from both sides. It's
whoa, true. Very cool, Michael. Very cool. I'm so glad that I brought you on here to talk about this, Michael. Now, this conversation's been going for a while. Do you have any final points that you'd like to consider before we call her a day here?
At this point, I think that's a good
note to end on. I was kind of feeling that myself. So everybody, this has been a wonderful presentation. As I said, I've been doing this with a few astrologers, and I was very excited to bring you on here, Michael, to talk with me about these things. And for everybody, again, if you're interested in seeing more of what Michael's all about, his individual process, and even if you want to get a reading from him, you can find him at Thetempleofsound.com.
Yes, we can see how these things are affecting you individually and how to best move through this gate.
That's it. Now, for me, myself, my name is Dustin Cormier. You can find me on my YouTube channel, How to Rock Astrology. And you can also find me on dustincormier.net for my own astrological services. It was our pleasure to talk with you guys about this coming trends that are happening. And I think I had a phrase on my head that I wanted to leave us with. And it's basically this. It comes from a poem from the 70s. It's a musical album that had lyrical poetry for each sign. And one of the lines in the Aquarius poem reads, "In the opal light of Aquarius, all people can blend and still remain what they are." And I think that's going to be an important theme in the coming time.
Oh,
Aho. Thanks again, Michael. I'm going to
yes.
stop this and I'll say bye to you, Michael. And for
All right.
everybody watching, we'll see you guys again. Thanks so much for hanging out with us.